Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Michel Momo will defend the academic thesis, A Multidimensional Perspective on Education in Developing Countries. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Dear Prorector, members of the Corona, family and friends, thank you for joining me today for the defense of my thesis titled A Multidimensional Perspective on Education in Developing Countries. I'm going to summarize the thesis in 15 minutes. So the motivation of this thesis stems from the fact that despite numerous efforts made to improve educational attainment in low and lower middle income countries, we still have a lot of children leaving school without obtaining secondary school certificates. As we can see from evidence in 2019, up to 42% leave school in sub-Saharan Africa without obtaining secondary school certificates, and 33% leave school in South and West Asia, while 17% leave school in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, these early school leavers are predominant among low-educated parents, a situation known as the intergenerational correlation of education, where children from households with low-educated parents also tend to obtain low education. So this intergenerational correlation of education phenomenon is what we emphasize on in this thesis. This is actually said to be caused by what children inherit from their parents or what is being passed down from one generation to the other. And they include conditions like limited opportunities at the macroeconomic level, and then social status, deprivation, and culture. Early school leavers are also predominant among poor households. It is believed that children from poor households actually are disproportionately ill-prepared before they start school. And this is said to be caused by the deficits they face from situations like illness, low support from parents, malnutrition, and material deprivation. Now, all these conditions are believed to affect early childhood development, or the foundational skills that children need to attain higher education. In the literature, there is evidence of the impact of macroeconomic factors, as well as the household deprivation on the intergenerational correlation of education. But this is predominant for the developed, or this is evidence available for developed countries. And our contribution to the literature is to analyze this evidence for low-income country setting. Why is this thesis relevant? Because education is needed to improve stability, health, peace, and gender equality. We also need education to reduce poverty, given its positive relationship with future earnings. As mentioned by UNESCO, the rate of poverty will be more than half if every individual will at least complete secondary school. Therefore, the objective of our thesis is to analyze intergenerational correlation of education in a multidimensional perspective, that is at the macro level and at the micro level. At the macro level, it's about institutional factors such that children inherit limited opportunities. And at the micro level, it's about household deprivation, or a household environment where children live in uncomfortable situations. So the macro level factors we use in this thesis are actually information available in the literature. And the household deprivation factors we use here, given that we are dealing with low-income countries, we consider what the poor explain as their uncomfortable situations or the problems they face in their day-to-day living. And this includes electricity, housing, child mortality, assets, sanitation, cooking fuel, school attendance, and drinking water. The structure and data are as follows. Chapter 2 is actually a literature review of the determinants of early school living in Africa and Asia. And we use 43 articles published between 2001 and 2018. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 are actually macro level analysis. And Chapter 3 is about the correlation between institutional factors and the intergenerational correlation of education. For this, we use 149 demographic and health surveys of the United States Agency for International Development between 1990 and 2014 for 48 developing countries. So these surveys are actually cross-sectional surveys that are nationally representative, and they give information on education, household membership, on health, on standard of living, and on consumer goods. We also use data from the World Bank, precisely the World Development Indicators, like the gross domestic product, and the worldwide governance indicators, like the extent of corruption. Following this analysis in Chapter 3, we now look at how a change in an institutional characteristic can ameliorate educational attainment. Here we use a case study, precisely the compulsory education change in Senegal in 2004. For this, we use the 2017 DHS on Senegal for the analysis. Chapter 5 is actually a micro-level analysis of the correlation between deprivation and intergenerational correlation of education. We use 27 DHS between 2012 and 2018 for 27 developing countries. And the deprivation factors, we take them from the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. For the literature review of Chapter 2, we use the pull, the push, and the fallout factors to understand early school living. The pull factors are actually factors that are usually in the form of needs and wants, and they are external to the school. So they pull students away from school. For instance, wage labor and lack of income. The push factors are factors that are internal to the school and they push students away. For instance, inadequate school facilities and corporal punishment. The fallout factors, on the other hand, are neither, or they do not arise from being pushed or pulled out of school. For instance, lack of interest in education and cultural belief. The result of the review shows that factors, or the dropout factors, are actually multi-perspective. That is, at the individual, the school, the family, and at the community level. The pull factors show high prominence. The findings therefore suggest that the regulation of the role of schooling costs, school provisions and quality, informal employment, gender and ethnicity, and the knowledge of the importance of education should be taken into consideration. Chapter 3 of the correlation between institutional characteristics and the intergenerational correlation of education, we carry out an intergenerational correlation of education analysis with the 149 surveys we have using multiple linear regressions. Now, after this, we use the coefficients from these regressions and relate them with the institutional factors. The results show that higher level of economic development, more years of primary education, more years of compulsory education, higher ratio of female to male labor force participation, and lesser student per teacher ratio negatively correlates with intergenerational correlation of education. The level of economic development in our sample is represented by the gross domestic product. And this value ranges from $196 to $10,000. And the number of years of primary education ranges from 3 years to 7 years. The number of years of compulsory education is from 5 years to 15 years. Female to male labor force participation is actually the percentage of female aged 15 years and above that participate in the labor market in an economy. And we have these from 16% to 108%. The student per teacher ratio in our sample is from 15 persons per teacher to 79 persons per teacher. Therefore, unfavorable institutional factors increase intergenerational correlation of education. So following this finding, we now assume that a policy that improves possibilities and opportunities will therefore increase the national average in education, which we observe in the next chapter. So chapter 4, which is the compulsory education policy change in Senegal. Compulsory education was increased from 6 grades to 10 grades. That is the inclusion of lower secondary education to the compulsory grade, the compulsory education system. Then lower secondary was now made free. So to ensure that school was actually free for both primary and lower secondary, grants were being provided to subsidize some schools, some public schools actually. And then it was also expected that enrollment would increase at the lower secondary level. Then to accommodate the increase in enrollment, some schools, new schools were being constructed at the primary and at the lower secondary level. To analyze this policy, we consider those aged 13 to 15 as a treatment group and those aged 16 to 18 as a control group. Because those aged 13 to 15 are no longer allowed to leave school early, while those who are aged 16 to 18 can leave school. And then we compared grade 10 completion, actually the completion of compulsory education between the treatment group and the control group using logistic regression. We also looked at how this policy affected post-compulsory grades completion, precisely grades 11 to 13. And we use the chi-square test of association for this analysis. So the results show that this policy change actually ameliorated educational attainment. Precisely, we find that the treatment group individuals are 7% more likely to complete grade 10 compared to the control group. And grades 11 and 12 completion are actually positively associated with the education policy. Increasing education access, therefore, using compulsory and fees-free education laws is capable of increasing compulsory grades completion and potential dynamic effects. The dynamic effect here is in the sense that not leaving school at the age of 12 makes it more likely you stay longer in school, as we observe from the likelihood of completing some post-compulsory grades. Chapter 5, which is the micro-level analysis of the correlation between deprivation and intergenerational correlation of education, we construct a deprivation index using the deprivation variables. And then we carry out multiple linear regression of children's education on the interaction between parents' education and the deprivation index. So the interaction between parents' education and the deprivation index is our variable of interest in this chapter. So the variable shows that the more you are deprived, the lower your educational attainment and the more your education tends to depend on the education of your parents. Therefore, higher deprivation increases intergenerational correlation of education. In conclusion, unfavorable institutional characteristics and household deprivation strengthens the intergenerational correlation of education. And they therefore suggest how policies and home environments may change to promote education mobility. Education mobility is a situation where children attain higher education as compared to their parents. So these change on the one hand by education policy changes, macroeconomic development, female employment. On the other hand, by reducing the deprivations faced by households, such that the correlation between the education of children and the education of parents can be minimized. Attention should also be drawn to the sequence of the relationship between these factors and educational attainment. That is a relationship over time between them. focusing on specific social context like a specific country or a specific region. Thank you for your kind attention. I give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. You'll find in front of you, next to the two supervisors whom you know, 3 members of the committee, and 2 other members will join the session online. So we're 5 members of the degree committee. The opposition will be opened by Professor Rolf van der Velde, who was the chair of the assessment committee, and Professor van der Velde is an expert in education and labor market and careers. And the floor is to him.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Michel, I want to congratulate you with a very well-written thesis. I think you address an important topic. It's about the intergenerational mobility of education. And this is a topic that is well researched in all of the OECD countries, but much less is known about the underlying processes in low and middle income countries. And your thesis actually tries to fill this gap. And I think that's really an important contribution to the field. I have 2 questions that are both related to chapter 3 that I want to discuss with you. In chapter 3, you look at the relation between institutional factors and a country's score on the intergenerational correlation in educational mobility. And one of your findings, is that almost 40% of this between country variation is explained by a set of indicators that you have on your list, such as GDP, life expectancy at birth, proportion of mobile cellular subscriptions, the extent of corruption, etc., etc. I always have a bit of a problem when I look at this kind of analysis where you focus on the macro level. Some people call this that these kind of analysis are prone to what I call ecological fallacy. That is, you draw a conclusion from a macro level perspective to something which is actually present at the micro level. And what you do is you look at the correlation at a country level, but in fact you're interested in how it affects an individual's chances to, have an education which is different, higher or lower than from his parents. So, in fact, that's also what you showed in the in one of your first slides. You say a cross-level interaction. Actually, you look at how institutional factors affect an individual's chance to educational mobility. So, in fact, the correlation you're interested in is to what extent is an individual's dependency on his or her parents' education affected by institutional characteristics. Now, your data actually allow you to analyze this because you have individual level data, I presume. So you could also have a sort of, say, micro level interaction model. My question to you is, did you look at that? And if so, what were the findings? And if you didn't look at that, how much variation would you expect that these institutional factors explain at the individual level? And related to that, I have a more substantive issue with the interpretation of the correlation at the country level. So intuitively, you seem to argue that this tells you something about the educational opportunities in a country. So correlation is very high, educational opportunities are low. If the correlation is very low, you have a lot of opportunities. But does it? Now, suppose you have 2 countries and they have exactly the same distribution of educational attainment for the parents. So the countries are exactly the same. Now, in country A, every child will have a education which is exactly one level or maybe 2 levels higher than from his parents. But this holds for all the children, so the correlation is 1. Now, in another country, you would have a situation where none of the children will have more than primary education. So the correlation is 0. What does it tell you about the educational opportunities in country A and B? Or say, one of the things you should look at is also say the absolute distribution of educational attainment. So what does the correlation tell you in this respect? I just want you to reflect a little bit on this.
Okay. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and for your question. I actually didn't look at the macro and the micro level interaction. So I was actually interested to look at conditions where it is highly probable that children will attain low education as did their parents. So I didn't look at the interaction between these terms. And then my analysis is actually based on correlation, so it's not on causality. It is merely about how these terms can correlate with educational attainment and how a further analysis on causality can be probably a baseline on how causal relationship can be looked at. And concerning the specific question on what I think of correlations between countries, I think that each country has got its own level of quality in education. But I know that what is important is that the level of quality of education that countries have will be reflected by the attainment of their parents and will also be reflected by the attainments of their children. But I think it's, in general, they portray how each country should look at how to ameliorate what they actually have as opportunity and what they actually have as a disadvantage. At the macro level, for instance, we have quality of education. Now, if a country, so if, for instance, if a country has a high ratio of, say, people-teacher ratio, so we expect that in such regions, if we have to go deeper, we will expect that in such regions, people from those, children from those regions will attain low education as compared to regions where we have low people-teacher ratio. And in general, I think this is a way of a way in which countries can look deep into the specific variables at the macro level and at the micro level to see which ones, if you change them precisely, will lead to ameliorating the educational attainment of the children. Thank you.
So I already raised my second question. So thank you for your answer. Back to Professor.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Louis Bolante, who is a professional fellow at the UniMerit at this university, and he was the second member of the assessment committee, and he will address you online. The floor is to Professor Bolante.
Hi, Michelle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first off, I wanted to congratulate you on your work. It was very interesting to read. So I have one question for you right now. It's in relationship to the class size issue that you raised on page 62 of your thesis, where you write, our findings further suggest that a higher pupil-teacher ratio increases intergenerational education correlation, while higher primary school duration years and compulsory years of education reduce the intergenerational education correlation. So my question is, given the significant costs associated with reductions in average class sizes and the ongoing contestation of this research topic in the contemporary literature, what do you consider to be the most important implications stemming from this finding for policymakers in low-income and lower middle-income countries? So essentially, I'm asking you to look forward and discuss what kind of advice or what kind of recommendation you would make on this issue in relation to class sizes. And I guess I would offer two comments about this. The first being that this is a very highly politicized topic. It's been so for a very long time, at least in the Western industrialized countries that I've worked with in terms of large-scale reform. And I would say that depending on stakeholder views, they tend to interpret this research quite differently. So, you can imagine that those that are in charge of teacher unions tend to have a particular bias in terms of how they interpret this research, and other government representatives might have a different view, particularly those that are trying to reduce budgets. So I'm really interested in hearing what your thoughts are on this topic. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comment and for your questions. Actually, what I think about the class sizes is that I believe the more students per teacher in a class, the lesser the attention paid on children, especially in terms of feedback, in terms of advice, and in terms of follow-up. I strongly believe that if you have a small number of students per teacher, say 20, 30, there will be high chance of them attaining there will be high chance of them attaining higher education, because there will be more opportunity for them to meet their teachers and explain their worries, and also to follow up on them on some issues that they didn't understand. But if you have a large class size, say 75 students per teacher, it's not going to be possible for the teacher to attend to everyone. Even if it does, it would be only occasionally. So I strongly believe that if you have less number of students, there is high probability of these students to attain higher education. That's what I believe regarding class size. And I don't know if I answered all your concerns.
I'm not sure if I'm able to ask a follow-up question. Is that okay? Sorry. Okay, so I guess the other question that I wanted to ask is a follow-up. Do you think that you had enough variability in terms of socioeconomic strata when you were looking at the class size issue? I mean, you do mention actually on this same topic that a significant percentage of the students were deprived, that they were from a lower socioeconomic background. So I'm wondering if you were able to distinguish the effect of class size depending on the composition of the individual classes that you looked at. So I guess what I'm trying to tease apart is, were there differences when you looked at the effect of class size depending on the composition of the classes themselves in terms of the student background and family characteristics? I'm not sure if you were able to unpack that. And that'll be my last follow-up.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. Unfortunately, I didn't look at the differences in this outcome with respect to their social background, but I think it would have been an important finding to know if this is actually representing a particular background of students. So I think this point is very important, but unfortunately, I couldn't look at it in detail. So I just could look at the general outcome of the variable.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Carla Hallemans, who is the third member of the assessment committee, who is a professor in human capital, educational technology, and inequality of this university. The floor goes to Professor Hallemans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear candidate, dear Michelle, let me first join the other opponents in congratulating you with this dissertation. I very much enjoyed reading it. And in this thesis, you focus on the education in developing countries. You firstly look at the intergenerational factors and reducing educational inequalities by policy actions. And secondly, you look at the role of institutional and contextual characteristics, and also household deprivation status in relation to the intergenerational mobility. I think your thesis discusses a very relevant topic. And I also think that the outcomes are very relevant for all the countries that are included in the data sets that you use. I think most research on this topic so far, and it has been said before, has been performed on developed countries, OECD countries, and we know from international research that research findings based on developed countries cannot simply be extrapolated to developing countries just like that. Especially the institutional contextual characteristics that you study are very different, and it's great that you contribute to that line of research with this thesis. So I think your thesis has very relevant findings for these developing countries. For example, for Senegal, which chapter 4 is about, I think the policy change that you studied, the lessons you can learn, we learned from that based on your work, very relevant for Senegal as a country. However, for the other chapters 3 and 5, you use combined secondary data sets of 48 countries in chapter 3 and 27 countries in chapter 5. And that's also what my first question is about, because that relates to the policy conclusions that you draw and the recommendations in relation to the fact that you use data sets and you study such a large set of countries that are, even though they all count among the low and lower middle income countries, they are still very different from each other. From an economic point of view, but also, well, at the time of the data collection of the data sets that you use, there were several countries, for example, struggling with very different circumstances, a civil war, infectious disease like Ebola. And all these very specific circumstances probably also very much influence the educational outcomes and the educational inequality or equality that you studied. And will probably indirectly or maybe directly, but they don't seem to be directly measured in the questionnaires, have influenced your analysis and also your results and conclusions. Okay, that was a very long introduction to the question, whether you can reflect a little bit on how you think the differences between the countries that are more specific than what's measured in the questionnaires, how that may have influenced your results, and maybe even more importantly, the policy recommendations. Aren't these recommendations either too broad or maybe too narrow? For example, you suggest to increase the teacher-student ratio, so we talked about that before, but that's only going to have an effect if children are actually able to come to school, and if there is a civil war or an infectious disease, they won't get to school. So then the suggestion might be too narrow and not be applicable to many countries. So can you reflect a bit on what the different countries can actually learn from the thesis, from the policy recommendations, given the large differences that there also still are?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comment and for your question. Yeah, actually, though I brought together a lot of countries, but I do know that some countries have got some specific extreme conditions as compared to other countries, which is something, unfortunately, we cannot look at given the fact that we bring all these countries together. And it would have been possible to look at all of these if we were considering a case-by-case approach. And for the recommendation I gave is actually a general observation, which I think for each country, it is not something you can just embark on as it is, but you can, like I suggested, that it is good to look at the relationship over time between these outcome and educational attainment, specifically on a particular country or a particular region. So I think if for a country to embark on this finding, it is also good to look in depth including all the conditions like you mentioned, probably civil war or illness. And to look at how some of these might have impacted, probably the educational attainment was improved before these conditions occurred. So it is also good for a country to embark on this, to now look at the relationship over time between this outcome and the educational attainment in their specific countries. If it is in the case where probably the education was in a good shape before they had a crisis, or probably this is something that has been evolving over time, I think from there it will well-informed policy on where to particularly focus interest, especially if it's on education. Probably student per teacher ratio is the greatest issue in a particular country, or probably the lack of necessary schools is the most significant issue in the country. So for my recommendation, I think a country should specifically look at how this has been evolving over time, and then to know how to go about the policy, what to focus first and what to come later on.
Okay, thank you. May I ask a second question? Thank you very much for this answer. I had a second question that actually relates to the conclusions you draw in chapter 4, so on the policy change in Senegal, and specifically about one of the remarks that you make at the end of the chapter. You mention in many places education is not subsidized, so parents may have to pay for school fees and other costs, and that could be an explanation why you don't see that large of an increase in people attending education. And so I started wondering, given that you find a relatively small effect of 7 percentage points of extending compulsory education, what role does this, whether or not education is subsidized, play in this? And I was just curious, if you were to set up a study to look into this question, how would you approach that? How would you want to study this? I look forward to the answer.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. Actually, the outcome on the compulsory education policy in Senegal, though it is significant, but the change is not actually sizable. Because if you look at the likelihood of completing compulsory education, for the control group is actually 22%, and for the treatment group is 33%. So this is, for the control group is 26% likelihood of completing compulsory education, and for the treatment group is 33%. This is why we have the 7% increase in likelihood of completing. But I think it is not sizable. It is the way it is because those schools were being subsidized is not sufficient. There is still the issue of inaccessible and cost of education. Because if you look at some of the schools were being subsidized while some were still collecting fees from the students. And then you also have the private sector, which is not subsidized. So if I was the one in the position to ameliorate educational attainment, I will make sure that education is being subsidized for all the households that cannot afford it. And another problem with the issue of subsidizing education is that even if you subsidize education, like the case of Senegal, you still have costs that parents bear, such as the provision of school bags, school shoes, accommodation, and health. So I think these are all problems that the government has to consider in order to achieve an effective impact from the compulsory education. Actually, we find an impact, but it's not very sizable. So I believe that compulsory education has to actually be free for all schools, and not only for public schools, but also for private schools where they collect school fees, and also to cater for the fact that households still need to pay for other expenses like school bags and school shoes. So that is my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. If there's time later, I'd like to come back to this, but.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Harry Patrinos, who is an expert in the practice of management education and at the World Bank. And the floors, he will also be addressing you online in the floors then.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Ms. Momo, on the achievement of your dissertation. Enjoyable read, and thank you for the hard work. I believe you put forward very clear research questions, hypotheses, addressed them adequately. The report was written clearly, well explained, adequate caveats. I was particularly impressed with the use of the compulsory schooling law in the case of Senegal to show how this reform affected school attainment and address some of the intergenerational issues that you are researching. I was also pleased to see how you brought in the quality of education. I agree with you and others that there's little research on intergenerational mobility in education in developing countries. You've added to this literature, but most of that literature is assuming that the education achieved is equal across generations, and we know that's not true. We also know the quality of education varies tremendously. And since you mentioned in your thesis also the SDGs, we should be reminded that one of them is to improve the quality of education. Yet we only have measures for very few low-income countries, and usually very few measures, if any. Would you say that the measures of educational progress are threatened by education quality? That is, someone may have more years of schooling as a result of, say, a reform with the compulsory schooling, but if the quality of that education is low, they're not adding as much as they would in a country that had higher levels of quality. How, if you had more and better data on actual school quality, learning outcomes for parents and children over time, how would you have made this analysis, and do you think it would have added to our knowledge base? And what recommendations do you have? I praised in my comments how you brought in school quality or proxies of school quality, but in the recommendations, there's very little said about the quality of education. So if you could expand on those two questions, I would be pleased to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your comment and for your questions. Yeah, actually, I think data on education over time will produce more insight on particularly what the issue is when it concerns educational quality. So what we did is actually representing everything concerning educational quality, from schools provision, class size, as well as quality teachers, and also important aspect of school like laboratory, and also playgrounds for children. But I think this is quite general. So it would have been great if we had this information on education over time. So and also details on specifically what is involved in educational attainment, or what is actually relating to the low educational attainment of children. Now, I think it is, or your suggestion, or what you asked is an important point. It would have made more sense if we had information on education over time. And also concerning your recommendation concerning education quality that I find in the outcome. I think education quality, for a start, is very important if we have to take into consideration the outcome I find from my study. If I had to suggest, or if I had to give a policy recommendation on what to consider to ameliorate educational attainment, I would begin by the quality of education. Because I know, though we talk of GDP, we know that you can't have sustained or proper industrialization without an educated population. So What I'm saying is that quality of education is the first priority if we have to consider ameliorating educational attainment. As we see from the findings, the educational attainment variables show more significant correlation with education of or intergenerational correlation of education. So I think education is top priority if we have to look at the outcome before going to industrialization. And I mentioned from the conclusion that industrialization is important. And I also mentioned that we need an educated population in order to attain industrialization. So my recommendation is that quality of education is an important aspect and it should be top priority if we have to look at ameliorating or improving educational mobility.
Thank you, Ms. Momo.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Meline Somas, who is a postdoc at the Research Center for Education and Labor Markets, focusing on health, skills, and inequality. Floor is you.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Michelle, let me first of all congratulate you with your achievements. In my view, you've written a very sound thesis that also proves your ability to conduct thorough scientific research. And I would also like to compliment you with the fact that you have published, if I'm not mistaken, all of the chapters in peer-reviewed journals. I nevertheless do have a number of questions on chapter 4, in which you assess the impact of a compulsory education reform in Senegal on educational attainment. So to assess the impact of the treatment or the reform, you compare students who were aged 16, 17, or 18 in 2005, so the control group, with students who were aged 13, 14, or 15 in 2005, the treatment group. So the first group is considered to be unaffected by the reform, while the latter group is considered to be affected. Now you find that individuals in the treatment group are on average 7 percentage points more likely to complete grade 10 than individuals in the control group. However, I'm also wondering to what extent this higher likelihood that you observe can actually be ascribed to the compulsory schooling reform. Because in figure 4.1 on page 78, you show that already far before the reform took place, there was a rising trend in the share of students that completed grade 10. So could you reflect on this, and can you maybe explain what you could do to further isolate the effect of the reform? Or could you maybe explain what the ideal research setup would have been in order to answer your research question?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your comment and for your question. Yeah, indeed, the compulsory education brought about an increase in the completion of compulsory school. But actually, we know for developing country settings, compulsory education has to be accompanied by these changes, like we see increasing schools, increasing number of teachers. And though we term this outcome the impact of the compulsory education, but we have to make mention of the fact that this outcome is as a result of the policy or the changes that took place to accompany the compulsory education policy. For instance, the provision of schools at the lower level and at the primary school level and at the lower secondary school level, and also the provision of or the subsidization of compulsory education, such that parents will not be allowed to pay fee anymore. So what I'm trying to say is that if we have to talk of compulsory education for developing country settings or for low-income country settings, we have to also make mention of the fact that these policies are actually accompanied by other changes, such as the construction of schools and the increase of quality teachers, and also to make education accessible for the poor who cannot normally afford education in order for these policies to be effective. But unfortunately, we cannot detangle the impact of just making education compulsory at the lower secondary from increase in number of schools. So compulsory education is actually the main policy, but if you have to look at the impact, you know that it is not only making school compulsory that is effective, it is the policies that accompany the compulsory education law that makes this policy effective. Like I mentioned, increasing schools and making education free for the compulsory levels.
Thank you, candidate. I understand that the reform was accompanied by many other interventions, such as decreasing the tuition fees for children and perhaps an increase in the number of teachers. But now let's consider that the reform that you look at is actually a package of a number of interventions. But then at the same time, before the intervention actually took place, or the reform in 2005, you actually show in figure, which one is it? Figure 4.1, you show that there was already a strongly increasing trend in educational attainment far before the reform took place. So what I'm wondering is, by comparing these number of cohorts, whether the effect that you observe, whether it can actually fully be ascribed to the reform and all other interventions that took place, or whether it can only also fully or maybe partly ascribed to the time trend that you actually show in your dissertation.
Thank you, esteemed opponent. Yeah, I know that the time trend can also impact on educational attainment. That is why I did this control of looking at what happened before the compulsory education policy change. So actually, if there was this significant change in compulsory education, we would at least, from the robustness check we carried out, we would have at least seen some significance in the outcome when we compare 3 years or 3 ages before and 3 ages after. So I think if there was actually an impact for time, or with regards to time, this is taken into consideration and this has been dealt with from the analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the first round, and it gives us an opportunity to start a second round, and I think it would be worthwhile to hear the chair of the assessment committee and give him the floor first in this second round. Professor Van der Velde.
Thank you, Rector. I have a question on chapter 5, which you look at the effect of deprivation and how that interacts with the parents' education in determining chances of children. I like that analysis very much, but I was wondering, so the deprivation index that you use, you have an index of a number of indicators, but among them are is an indicator of school attendance, and it's also partly what you're looking at, right? So it's you're putting something in the outcome measure, which you also put in your, say, the variable of interest that you have. Did you consider you could have made a deprivation index without that indicator, I guess. Did you consider doing that? Have you done it as a robustness check?
Highly esteemed opponent, I don't know if I understand very well. Do you mean looking at the index without the variable child, school attendance?
You have this index, I think it's on page 100. You have an index composition, and I think there are, say, 9 indicators: child mortality, school attendance, cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing assets. You lump them together into an overall index, and look at how that affects the educational attainment. Now, you could also have done an index without the school attendance, because school attendance is actually what your dependent variable is as well. Of course, it should affect your outcome measure. How does that bias your results?
Oh, highly esteemed opponent. Before carrying out or before constructing the index, I actually looked at the correlation between school attendance and the outcome itself. Because school attendance is actually households that have a child up to the age of completing grade 8 that is not attending school. So it is actually different from the educational attainment outcome we are looking at, which is education in years. Yes, the educational attainment, which is education obtained in years. So before constructing the index, we made sure that we looked at the correlation between this outcome and the educational attainment, which is the dependent variable. And we looked at it at the country level and as well as the pooled sample, but we didn't find high correlation between these two variables. That is why we included it in the index.
I can understand that, and so I'm not worried that your results are really biased, but why would you take the risk? Why would you include it? So if I think of a deprivation index, I would think that that would strictly hold to all the economic indicators, like, income, drinking water, things like that. So it's really deprivation, housing, child mortality, rather than something which is conceptually very much linked to your outcome variable. So why would you do it? I mean, your results will probably not change, but
I didn't look at it in the sense that this is education and we are also dealing with education. So actually my focus was on what the poor explain as their uncomfortable situation. So if they say school attendance is an issue for them, so I thought it would be also important to look at school attendance. So if the variable school attendance is explaining high intergenerational correlation of education, then there should be something particularly wrong with households that have this issue of school attendance, having children not attending school up to the age of completing grade 8. So that is how I looked at it. I said, yes, if this is a part of their troubles, then it should be looked at. And if it has an impact on, or if it actually correlates with what we are looking at, then it is something that should be taken into consideration. That is why I didn't consider the fact that it is based on education, like we are also looking on education.
Thank you. The opposition can be shortly continued by Professor Louis Bolante. If he still has a question, would you still have like the floor, Professor Bolante?
Sure, I'll ask a quick question. I'll give you an abbreviated version because we don't have much time. So Michelle, most of your findings are largely congruent with the existing literature on socioeconomic inequality and educational outcomes such as school completion. So I guess my question is, what would you say is the most glaring difference between the results you found in lower income and middle income countries compared to the global north? And probably I would urge you to think about, if you had to explain what is impacting school completion rates in the countries you looked at, what would be different about that context that you looked at compared to the industrialized Western countries where a lot of this research has been done for some time?
What I think about low-income countries when it when it comes to the findings is that low-income countries are actually facing more issues as compared to the industrialized countries, especially in terms of education. So I think there is still a lot to be done if we have to improve on educational attainment. And I think we have to, more importantly, consider education, because from the finding, it shows that education is very, very important if we have to deal with other issues like So I think that these countries have to really focus on the quality of education if they have to find themselves in an industrialized position as we have the other countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michel Momo, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Yay.
Michel Momo, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Wim Groot is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university system, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Michelle Sunkeng Mimiandor Momo, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached to it by law and custom. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Dr. Momo, dear Michelle, Sunkeng Mimiandor. It gives me great pleasure.
Please use the microphone.
It gives me great pleasure to be the first to congratulate you with your PhD. I also do this on behalf of Sophie. I speak for both of us when I say that you have done a good job. Both of us found it a great pleasure to work with you and to supervise you doing your PhD research. The shine of your dissertation and your defense today also shines a bit on us. We're very proud of your achievement. This is a special and exceptional day. A PhD defense is always something special, something I think you should only do once in your life, and something not many people can say they have ever done in their life. But your defense is even more special. The reason why it's so special and exceptional event is not only because you have done a great job doing the defense. I already said you made us proud, as I urged upon you before your defense already. You've written an elaborate thesis with 4 papers, which have all been published in good quality peer-reviewed journals, like the International Journal of Educational Development and Review of Education. We have a tradition that we include in the laudation some appropriate poetry. I want to cite a few lines written by a poet from Cameroon named Mabela Sonedipoko. He was a novelist, poet, and painter who is widely considered to be one of the foremost writers in English from Cameroon. And the title of the poem is Exile, and I like to read, and it reads like this. The night is losing its treasures. The future seems a myth, warped on a loom worked by lazy hands. But perhaps all is not without some good for us, as from the door 1,000 miles away, a scaly hand of a child takes in greeting the long and skinny fingers of the rain. What is noteworthy that the poem was written in 1968, and Dipoko seems to have a good sense of foresight of what was come to happen. You're also in exile from your country, more or less, just like your brother and sister, who I see here sitting, who have settled here in Europe and in the US. I can well imagine that when you left your country, your future seemed a myth to you too. Perhaps it still is. After you have left Cameroon, you applied as an unpaid PhD researcher at TIER. Contrary to PhD candidates from the Netherlands who expect to be paid and have an employment contract to write a dissertation, you had to finance your living expenses by writing your dissertation all by yourself. The Netherlands prides itself on being a country with equal opportunities, but when it comes to PhD researchers, some people are more equal than others. It's a great achievement that you have succeeded, despite this lack of support. It's also telling that you never complained about that. Whenever I wanted to raise the issue, you more or less avoided it, is my impression. Although it doesn't quite seem right that the university receives a large sum of money for the efforts you've done supplied for free. But nevertheless, the warp on a loom that Ipoko writes about is the steady work you did on writing your dissertation, driven by the motivation that better education is key to improve life chances for children, and that knowledge and insight in the role of education helps to draw more attention to this. Better education improves health, wealth, and happiness, especially for those who are already disadvantaged by poverty. The contribution of your dissertation is that it sheds light on the persistence of inequalities through the intergenerational transmission of education. In recent years, attention to social inequality in our Western world has increased. Much of this is focused on inequities in outcomes, like income and wealth inequality, and inequalities in life expectancy and health. The main source of these inequalities in outcomes are inequalities in access to good education. Also came around during the opposition, the trade-off between good education and the intergenerational transmission of education, or educational disadvantage. Your dissertation shows that in low-income countries, social mobility is limited by the intergenerational transmission of education. If your parents are lowly educated, this reduces your own chances of a good education. You've extended our knowledge on this phenomenon by showing that it's reinforced by deprivation. For children living in deprivation, the influence of parents' education on your own educational attainment is even stronger. Living in deprivation and having low educated parents are two ties on your chances in life. The second novelty is that you show how institutions play a role in the intergenerational transmission of education. Good governance loosens the ties that your parents' education has on your own educational attainment. Consequently, good governance in low-income countries contributes to lessen social inequalities. Finally, let me again congratulate you, Dr. Momo, with your achievement, also on behalf of Sophie. It's nice that we can celebrate your achievement here today with you. I also want to extend our congratulations to your mother, who's watching it on live stream, your sister and brother, and all those who have come around the world to celebrate this joyful event with you here today, or have watched it through the live stream. I finally want to take the opportunity to thank Louis Volante and Harry Petrinos, members of the assessment committee who joined online. The others I will have the opportunity to thank for their effort and work after this session. And I'm grateful for the opposition and the discussion of the work that they have provided to you today.
Dear Dr. Momo, also on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you, your family, and your supervisors with the honor you have acquired. I would like to thank the members of the Degree Committee for contributing to this session. And immediately after I close this session, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Bolante and Professor Petrinos, because they would like to congratulate you a bit from further away. I close this session and the floor goes to Professor Bolante and Professor Petrinos.